Well, welcome to another episode of Cage-Free Theology. I'm Clint Archer.
And I'm Will Brannon.
What's our question today, Will?
Our question for the day is war ever just?
Let's just get into it.
I liked that one. So whenever we talk about is war just, we are talking about something called just war theory. For those that don't know what that means, what is just war theory?
Just war theory is a paradigm of thinking, principles to apply. I think about 7 of them to help Christians think through when a war would be justified. And the reason this is there is traditionally, over the years to help Christians think through, can I participate in this war? Should I be protesting this war? When the Civil War broke out in America, you had two sides both believing that they were doing God's will. So you had Christians fighting against Christians. In different wars, a soldier might decide to conscientiously object, or a Christian who's been drafted into the military, if they believe that the war is unjustified. And yet there's some wars that people have fought to the glory of God. For example, there was not much opposition to the idea that the Allies needed to resist the spread of Nazi Germany, for example. And yet there was a lot more opposition to other wars, let's say the conflict in Vietnam, for example.
So there's kind of two ways that you could come at it. Look at is any one individual war that has happened in history actually just or justified? And then you could also look at what are the principles that you use to even determine that? What's the framework? That's what we're talking about, is the framework to even say what kind of principles would render a war just, if at all. Is there any such thing as a just war? So let's put our cards on the table at the start. Would you say that there is any such thing as a just war? In terms of a Christian worldview, is that even possible?
Yes, I think that we live in a world with bad people that need to be stopped from doing bad things. And if everybody did the right thing all the time, we wouldn't need war. I would say it this way. War is always bad, but it's not always wrong.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you think it's fair to add to that a war, meaning that the principle behind the war, the reason may be just, but every war will involve in its carrying out injustice. We're not saying that there can be a war that can be perfectly just from beginning to end. We're talking more about the cause.
Yeah, for example, civilians are always casualties of war.
Right. So when you think about just war theory, there's a number of principles that go into this that Christians have spoken about, and I'm going to dive into these. And the point of these is not so much to say, hey, these principles allow war. The point of this is to restrict war, to say only in these very specific parameters can a war be considered just, if we start with Scripture as our authority. So do you want to give any preliminary thoughts before I start diving into some of these one at a time?
No, let's do it. Are you going to give us some Latin?
Yeah, I can give you some Latin, yes. So correct me if I say this incorrectly, but we're going to start with principles related to jus ad bellum, which is principles related to going to war. Yes. And then later we can talk about principles about how to carry out a war. But we're going to start with principles that determine is it right or wrong to actually go into a war.
Yeah, jus ad bellum means justice into war. And then there's the next one, jus in bellum, which means justice in the war. The way that you actually wage the war needs to be just.
Right.
And then there's jus post bellum, which is just another condition.
So jus ad bellum is where we're going. So here's the first one that I have written down.
Oh, hold on. Can I just tell our listeners the reason we're even going to the Latin is because if you look this up and you study this, you're going to find writings by Augustine. You're going to be finding writings by Thomas Aquinas. These are the categories that Thomas Aquinas established. And so when people talk about it, they think in those 3 categories.
Sure. Okay, so the first one, as far as principles of going to war, in order for the war to be considered just, you have to have a just cause, or sometimes how you see this said is a just intention. What does that mean? What would that look like?
And let me also say that each of these, what makes it so complicated is, firstly, for this to be a just war, you need all of the principles in place, and each one of them is going to have a subjective element where someone might say, I see it this way, I don't see it that way.
Sure.
And so, but in general, what you're looking for as a Christian, if you are being asked to fight in a war, or if you are a leader who is making a decision of whether or not to declare war, or if you're in Congress and you have to vote or anything like that, the first condition is that there must be a just cause. There must be a reason that is considered a valid reason. And these days, a valid reason is not, for example, I just want more territory.
Right. Just expanding my geography.
But a valid reason, an example of that would be protecting a people group from genocide, for example, or, more controversially, preempting the use of weapons of mass destruction or nuclear intent against another country, or you are an ally with a country that is being attacked unjustly, and you are called to help defend them as the treaty established it. So those would be cases of just war.
Yeah. So historically, a just cause would be a cause that's intended to protect life, to protect or restore justice, to somehow cause or bring about peace and order.
Yeah, and almost always defense of your own country from invasion is going to qualify.
Yeah, and I think that's something that inevitably comes up here is to what degree is the cause just for a cause somewhere in the world or a cause specifically for your country? Because there's a lot of discussion today about, well, it might be a just cause, meaning, yeah, it's good to stop some heinous genocide that's happening somewhere, but to what degree is it just or a right cause for an individual nation to kind of get involved with another one? How do you think through that?
I think as we go through some of these principles, it'll make it clearer.
Okay.
Because it's almost a separate discussion is should a superpower like the United States of America bear the responsibility to help other countries that can't help themselves?
Right.
And some would say, no, this is a foreign policy thing. This is their problem. And others would say, well, no, because we have that capability to help, we should help.
Right.
We ought to.
Yeah. And so we can kind of build on that as we work through. So here's the next one that I have. Last resort. The principle of last resort. What does that look like?
You always want to start with diplomatic channels if possible. Everybody understands that war is going to lead to the loss of innocent life, and that's the main thing we want to stop or prevent or avoid. And so if you're looking for a condition of the last resort, that means you haven't just said, well, they did something we didn't like, and so we're just going to go and attack them. But rather, can we get them to back down from their threat? Can we get them to step back through diplomatic means? And only when it becomes clear that that's not possible, that's when you elevate things militarily.
Yeah, I think about this in a really small illustration of church discipline in the church. You don't start with the last step. You have this series of steps that you go through, and then the last resort is this expression of violence. If at all possible, you do what you need to do through peaceful resolution.
Exactly. I mean, we're going to be doing an episode shortly on divorce. Same thing. You don't have a fight with your spouse and go and get divorced. Like there's always going to be, let's see if we can reconcile this thing.
Right.
Right.
Okay. This next one is one that some people would say, well, with this one, there's no such thing as a just war. Competent authority.
Is it competent authority or is it nationhood?
I've heard it both ways. Okay, competent authority or nationhood.
What competent authority means is that it has to be a legitimate nation that's fighting. It can't be a terrorist group, for example, or a group of individuals. You know, you and I can't just decide to take up arms against Greenland or whatever, ourselves. But so it needs to be a legitimate authority.
Right. Yeah. So give some other examples of what might be an illegitimate authority. So obviously terrorists should not wage war, individual civilians. What else would determine if something is a valid authority to go into war?
Well, for example, in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, you had the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, fighting against Britain, really, the British authority, and those were terrorist attacks. The IRA was not a republic. They wanted to become a republic, but they weren't a government. They were a terrorist organization. They had a political wing, but that was not a legitimate government, for example. It does get more complicated when the very issue of the war itself is a determination of whether or not there should be a legitimate government.
Or acknowledged as a legitimate government.
China and Taiwan, for example, or Palestine and Israel. And then, of course, the Republic of Ireland and Ireland or Northern Ireland. So those type of issues boil down to, well, we're fighting, even the American Revolutionary War to a certain sense. Like we're talking about who is the legitimate government. So that's the most complicated. But yeah, for it to be a just war, it can't just be a terrorist organization, or it can't just be a group of people who decide this, an ideology that decide this.
Yeah, thinking of it in kind of biblical terminology, Romans 13:1, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. So is it a governing authority put in place by God, or is it just some random group or gang that says we declare we have authority?
Right, and this is why the Crusades failed this test, because the Crusades were basically the Catholic Church declaring war on various nations and invading various nations, and the Catholic Church was not a recognized government. Nowadays the Vatican is a recognized state, but it doesn't really have an army that could invade anyone.
Yeah. Now, this question, this is not me defending the Crusades. Let me put that out there. But do you think that's a little bit trickier back then because they didn't have the understanding of separation in church and state that we do today? Yes. So it's not like the Catholic Church then was the same as like the religious Catholic Church today. There was much more of a merger of the church with the powers of the nation.
Yes.
Do you think that's a fair observation?
Yes.
Yeah. But my point is that there's a lot of layers to this. Yes. This gets super complicated.
Each one of these is going to be complicated.
So nationhood, the next one that I have is proportionate objectives. Proportionate objectives. What does that look like in terms of just war?
I think what this is referring to, same as a proportional response, is that you want to de-escalate the war as much as possible. So even if you do need to use force, you want to use as little force as possible to achieve your objective. And so, for example, if a country bombs our World Trade Center, or that was a little bit more complicated in 9/11 because that was a terrorist organization. But let's say a country attacks a power station, or Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. Okay, there you go. So you have a government bombing another government. Well, you don't go straight to let's go drop nukes on Hiroshima. I mean, that would be a disproportional response for the sinking of ships at Pearl Harbor. So a proportional response is we mobilize our Navy and go sink their ships.
Right.
And it will escalate, but it ought, there should be a restriction on that escalation as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think that also pulls in, there should be an understanding for a war to be just, that what we're gaining is greater than what we're going to lose. War is awful. War is never not awful. So if governing authorities are thinking through going to war or causing a war, there's the biblical category here, the theological category is you have to know that whatever horrific things come as a result of that action, it's outweighed by whatever you're trying to achieve.
Right.
Right. So taking this back to the American Revolution, what that would look like is we're establishing a nation, and that cause in the end is greater than the temporary effects of the war itself.
Right.
Okay.
Maybe invading Greenland and risking tens of thousands of lives.
You keep mentioning Greenland. I'm not touching Greenland.
No, I mean, I actually don't have I'm not trying to make a political statement. I just keep thinking of like a piece of land that really might not be worth shedding blood over.
I have no idea the value of Greenland. I can't say. Anyways, okay. Probability of success is another one that comes up. Probability of success.
Yes, and the point here is that human life is valuable, and so you don't want to be wasting it. Yes, people are willing to die for their country and shed their blood and sacrifice their lives. But why would we do that if we knew it's not going to gain anything? It's not going to work. So you wouldn't expect your soldiers to go and just give themselves and for nothing, that you knew you could not win this war. You would rather need to surrender than and make peace rather than sacrifice people for no reason.
Yeah, which also assumes there has to be a way to actually identify we achieved the objective. We actually did what we are trying to do. So it's not this, sometimes you hear people condemn, and I think rightly so today, forever wars. This idea of like, what is the goal here? What are we trying to accomplish? Probability of success means there is a realistic way for us to achieve this.
And you need a definition of success.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You need to know what your objective is.
How do we know that we've won this war?
Yeah, and this comes out of, I have a passage here that kind of speaks to this in Luke 14. Now, the context here, Jesus is speaking about counting the cost of being a disciple, but he assumes the validity of a military principle when he says it. He says in Luke 14, 31 and 32, or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000, or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So Jesus is saying, before you become a disciple, disciple, just like a king in war, you need to think through, can you actually accomplish this objective?
Right.
And when I say accomplish, I don't mean earn your salvation. Just you need to think through what you're doing before you take action.
Right.
Okay, so those are some of the principles of determining, is going to war just? Do you want to add anything to those before I move on to conducting a just war?
No.
Okay, so principles of conducting a just war. Some of these are going to have overlap, but we can now talk through what does this look like in the process of war as opposed to thinking through going to war. Another one that comes up is proportionality. So what does proportionality look like in terms of conducting or carrying out a war?
Right. Like I said before, you don't want to destroy an entire infrastructure of a nation that's going to leave the people in a worse position than they were before, unless it becomes necessary to do that. So it's always proportional. They bomb something of ours, we bomb something of theirs. We don't go wipe them all out because they bombed something of ours.
Yes. Sure.
And the whole idea is there because you want to minimize loss of civilian life. And I think that one of the main principles boils down to who you're allowed to attack in war. That's one of your principles you're about to mention.
Yeah, that's where we're going next. These are connected. Discrimination or non-combatant immunity.
Yeah, so this was established by the Geneva Convention, for example, when a bunch of nations got together and said, look, it's always ideal not to go to war, but if we ever do go to war against each other, these are some rules that we all agree on. For example, if somebody's wearing a big red cross on a white background on their helicopter or on their ambulance or truck or on their person, that means that they are a medic and you're not allowed to shoot them. So you can't shoot down, you cannot deliberately target medics, for example, or civilians. Yeah.
So let me read a couple Bible verses. This is a little bit lengthy, but I think it's important that we fold these in so it doesn't just sound like we're talking off the top of our heads. So this is a principle as far as discrimination or non-combatant immunity. Deuteronomy 20:19-20 says this: if you besiege a city for many days to make war against it in order to capture it, you shall not destroy its trees by swinging an axe against them. For you may eat from them, and you shall not cut them down. For is the tree of the field a man, that it should be besieged by you? Only the trees which you know are not trees for food you shall destroy and cut down, that you may build siege works against the city that is making war with you until it falls. So the point is, if you're going to war, go to war, but you don't just destroy the means of survival for the civilian population. That's not how you wage war. That's going after non-combatants instead of other armies, militaries, right? Yeah. Okay. Prohibition of abuses in terms of conducting war is another principle for a just war. Prohibition of abuses.
Are abuses they're referring to like torture and things like that?
Yeah, I think as I was looking into this, it could be the basic principle is even your enemies, you're treating humanely in the sense of there should not be. There's a certain word I don't want to use that involves abuse, but doing that to women or children or treating inhumanely the enemy or the civilian population.
Yeah, and I think that's where the idea of like the white flag comes up as a convention, that if you realize that you're outnumbered and you want to surrender and you wave the white flag and you indicate that you want to surrender, there's a moral obligation from the other side to not abuse that vulnerability. You've laid down your arms, you're coming with your hands up, you don't shoot them. That's against the rules. And there literally are rules in the Geneva Convention that you can't shoot a person who's surrendering. You have to take them, you have to feed them, you have to care for them, you have to give them medical attention, and in return they're doing the same for your soldiers.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. So those are some principles of determining if a war is just to get into and conducting a war. I want to pivot here a little bit and think about Christians and how Christians may or may not relate to war. So you have this idea of conscientious objectors.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on, can Christians serve in the military? Can Christians go to war? Should Christians not go to war? Give us some pastoral thoughts on that.
Well, I think of when the soldiers came to John the Baptist and said, what do we do as a sign of our repentance? And he didn't say, well, you're going to have to stop being soldiers.
Yeah.
He said, be content with your wages and don't abuse your power.
Yeah. In other words, he says you have a prohibition of abuses. Don't abuse your role, but not get out of the military.
Yeah. So I think absolutely Christians can be part of the military endeavor, and they can be a part of a just war. And the only time I would say a Christian needs to be a conscientious objector, and so what that is a person who says, I'm not going to take up arms, but I will bear the consequences of that. So, for example, if you were drafted to go and fight in Vietnam, and you said, well, I'm a Christian, and I don't think this is just war, and I don't want to go, you'll go to jail. There'll be a court martial. and you may say, well, I would rather go to jail than do that and take those consequences. That's a conscientious objector. And the only time I think a Christian should do that is if your conscience is really bound by the word of God, that what you're being asked to do is a sin. And so even in warfare, you may be fighting and you get a command to go into that village and wipe out all the civilians. Well, you know that that's murder, even according to the rules of war. And so you should be willing to stand up to that, even if that means that you're going to there's going to be a consequence for you personally, because you're a Christian and you serve a higher authority than even your commanding officer.
So if you're a Christian and you are serving in the military and you are called to go to a war that at the end of the day, politically, you don't think it's a just war, would you view that as a reason to conscientiously object? Or would you say, no, it needs to go beyond just you don't agree with it? You have to view it as directly sinful in some specific way.
I mean, these things get so complicated. I think if I were very convinced it was an unjust war, for example, if I was drafted into the military and this war is all about just taking territory from innocent people and wiping them out because they've got, I don't know, oil or something, gold, something that we need, then I mean, I would have to be very sure, because one of the things I want to just bring to mind here was a psalm I thought of. This is a verse that guides me a lot in when I question the government's decisions. Psalm 131, verse 1. O Yahweh, my heart is not exalted, my eyes are not raised high, and I do not involve myself in great matters or matters too marvelous for me. I think that there's a humility involved where you go before the Lord saying, this is above my pay grade. Like, I don't know what they know. I don't know the intelligence that they've gathered. My job is just to do what I'm told. As long as I'm not being told to sin, I'll do it. Because I always assume that whatever they're talking about in the Situation Room, they've got intelligence. They're not telling the public to make the public know, and they're not telling they're not telling the soldiers either. They're not telling the people that they're sending into battle.
Yeah, we don't know everything. Yeah, we can't. Yeah. So if you think about the idea of being a conscientious objector, that inevitably gets into the idea of you can't think about just war without thinking of pacifism, or the principle of what some Christians call absolute non-resistance. Just no matter the context, Christians should never use violence, no matter the situation. So you have verses like Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Matthew 5:39, but I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. So is pacifism, the idea that war or violence is never justified in any situation, would you view that as biblical, and why or why not?
I don't think that blanket pacifism is biblical, because in Romans 13, Paul specifically says that every institution that's been put there has been put there by God, that they do not bear the sword in vain, meaning lethal force.
Right. Swords are violent by nature of what they do. Yeah.
And they don't bear it in vain, and that you don't have anything to fear if you are submitting to that authority. But if you resist it, then he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. He told Peter when Peter tried to defend Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so he also, by the way, Jesus does tell the disciples to, sell a cloak and buy a sword for what's coming, because you're going to be out in the bushes. There's going to be, wild animals. There's going to be robbers and that kind of thing. Get yourself a Glock if you're going on a mission trip, kind of thing. I mean, that's an crass overstatement of it. But I think that there is an acknowledgement that all humans, Christians included, have the right to defend their safety, the right to defend the innocent and vulnerable, like children, and certainly a man's prerogative is to look after the life of his family. But I also draw a distinction there between your personal response and a national response.
Right.
Because government has been given that sword and that right. So warfare is a little bit different than if somebody is breaking into my house or attacking my family. It's not like I'm going to go through all 6 steps of the just war theory there. It's like my responsibility is to look after these people that have been trusted to me. And that could be a school bus driver wanting to spare the life of the kids on the bus from an attacker or something. I think that we who have the ability to have the responsibility to look after the vulnerable wherever, and that sometimes needs force. I would also have a separate category for receiving persecution. I think that if those verses that you mentioned there, turn the other cheek, don't resist an evil person, that's in the context of persecution for being a Christian. And so, for example, if a child of mine was being bullied at school for being a Christian, then I would go to those verses and tell them, this is how you're going to win these people over for Christ, is by not resisting them. And yet, I would also say it's perfectly legitimate to get the governing authorities involved. In the case of the school, is to go report that bully, but not to fight back if it's about being a Christian.
Would you draw a distinction there between, if it's not being a Christian, meaning persecution, for example, losing something versus a threat to your life? Or would you say there are cases where if the persecution is a threat to the life of a believer or those around you, it is valid to use some sort of force to defend yourself, even in the case of persecution?
Yeah, I know. Again, every situation is so nuanced and tricky, but I think in general, the idea is if a person is using lethal force, somebody's pulled a gun or a knife on you or an innocent person. I mean, if I see a man robbing a child or a woman at gunpoint or knife point, I feel like it's my responsibility to go and help that person. So, I mean, and this was very real in South Africa. I mean, this is why I signed up for Krav Maga classes, which is a martial art of self-defense, especially disarming people with guns and knives. The reason you do that is because it's necessary to protect your life from evildoers. Now, if somebody's trying to steal my wallet, just give them my wallet. Why?
Sure.
Because my life is more important than money.
Yeah. And God's law draws that distinction in the book of Exodus. I was thinking about this when I knew we were going to record this episode. Exodus 22 verse 2 says, if the thief is caught while breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no blood guiltiness on his account. Now, what's very interesting is then the very next verse in verse 3 says that if he's struck and he dies in daylight, totally different story. And I think the principle there is if you perceive that there is a threat to your life or the life of your family in your home, you have the right to meet that threat with force. If this is just about your property and you know there's no threat to your life, then the idea is no, your property is not the same as you and your loved ones.
Right.
But there's an understanding of if there is a physical threat to you and your family, you have the right to meet that with force. At least
that's a fascinating verse.
Yeah.
And we were even taught that. So Krav Maga is an Israeli defense system that's been devised by the Israeli Defense Force. And the first thing that we're always taught is run. You know, if somebody's trying to attack you, escape.
Yes, absolutely.
The only time you fight back is when you cannot escape, like you've been cornered or, you're helping somebody who's vulnerable or something like that. And when it comes to a time now to defend yourself, it's only because you have not been able to diffuse the situation and run away.
Yeah. Same thing with, I've sat through, I don't know how many, like concealed carry firearm classes, and the vast majority of them, most of the training focuses on de-escalation. The whole point is find a peaceful solution if at all possible.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Anything else you want to touch based on just war, self-defense?
I know.
Okay. I thought you were going to have something there. All right. Well, with that said, that does it for this episode of Cage-Free Theology.